30 of the top economies did not have enough labor this year, cost them $1.3 trillion. So there's this moment where we can begin to align the movement of people with opportunities with a tragic incident that happened off the coast of Greece where 300 Pakistani nationals lost their lives. We know that people are desperate for job opportunities. If you are a country in Europe at this moment in time where you do not have enough of your own national workers to do any number of jobs, migration makes sense. It actually is a much more effective way of addressing labor needs than trying to develop AI.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining me today is a special guest who deals with government and non-governmental organizations on various issues of migration and human trafficking induced by conflicts and disaster. My guest today is the Director General of International Organization for Migration, Ms. Amy Pope. Ms. Amy Pope, welcome to InferTalks.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Ms. Amy Pope, right at the outset, I must congratulate you. You're the first ever woman DG of the organization itself. Let me ask you, what's your leadership vision for such a critical multilateral institution?
So, first of all, thank you for having this conversation. I think migration is one of the most significant issues of this moment in time. We are seeing it play out across the world, right, politically, as well as in terms of the movement of people. And from where I sit, it's actually a moment where we can do tremendous good. I see, frankly, the stars aligning in terms of various forces in the world, right? So you think about it, we have millions of people who are on the move today, a range of people moving because of conflict, because of climate change, because of poverty. But we also have a moment in time where there are economies across the world that are experiencing labor shortages, right? 30 of the top economies did not have enough labor this year, cost them $1.3 trillion, right? So there's this moment where we can begin to align the movement of people with opportunities, which ultimately will result in better outcomes for everyone.
And so where do you see crises induced by pandemics like the COVID-19 that have sort of affected this very significant aspect as well, the aspect of even legal migrations itself? So how do you think you would sort of be making sure that something like that is also overcome?
So if you look at COVID, it actually highlights why migration is so important. It played out in a couple of ways. First, in terms of migrants who were in countries already, it was often the migrants who actually kept performing the work even while COVID was ongoing, because migrants filled many of the service sector jobs. So even while many people were sheltering at home, migrants were out, migrants as nurses and doctors, migrants as bus drivers and offering other social services. Across the world, we saw this play out. So we know that migration is necessary. But at the same time, as governments shut down borders and people were not able to move regularly, it actually had a cascading negative economic effect, which helps to demonstrate why having much more regular migration channels is critical for economic development across the world. So from our point of view, our goal is to make sure that we are enabling more safe, orderly, regular migration because we know that it works for all people.
And now, speaking of Pakistan, you are on your maiden visit to the country itself. Let me ask you, what are the topmost agenda items on your list for this visit?
Well, first of all, it's my first 100 days, and this is my first trip to Asia as the Director General for IOM. And it was important for me to come to Pakistan for a couple of reasons. Number one, when we look at what are the drivers of migration, we see them playing out here, first and foremost with climate change. I mean, we know the floods here in Pakistan displaced millions of people internally, and many of those people continue to be displaced. Pakistan is not an outlier. In fact, last year we saw more people displaced by climate than conflict. And if you look ahead to the future, we know that will be the number one driver of human movement in the years to come. So being here, being able to understand the impact of climate change on the people of Pakistan, that's absolutely critical. But secondly, it's understanding that if we agree that regular migration will be necessary for future development of all people, it's really looking to how can we work with Pakistan to enable legal pathways for people, right? We know with a tragic incident that happened off the coast of Greece where 300 Pakistani nationals lost their lives, we know that people are desperate for job opportunities. And frankly, there are jobs available, but you should not have to get on a boat to get your job. You should be able to get a visa. You should be paid fairly. You should be recruited fairly. And ultimately, that is in the interests of the countries who are hosting migrants, as well as the countries that are sending migrants. So those key issues, facilitating regular pathways and anticipating, responding, and adapting to the climate crisis, playing out here in this country in full view.
Yeah, speaking of human trafficking or irregular migration, Pakistan certainly happens to be, one of those countries which is certainly affected in a way where, people would want to, as you just pointed out, adopts, illegal measures or irregular measures of moving to greener pastures. And that, of course, remains a topmost priority issue for Pakistan and its partners, in Western countries or other regions. Where do you think the role of IOM really comes in to help Pakistan overcome or fix this problem?
There is a gap when it comes to recruiting people for lower skilled jobs. That seems to be the primary gap. So if you are a Pakistani national who is a doctor or an engineer or a nurse, you are going to have no problem getting access into the job market. I won't say no problem, but it is much easier, and you will have the skills and the understanding, and you're going to be heavily recruited and including more and more in the future. But where we see people take irregular migration pathways, it tends to be in the lower skilled sectors. People who don't necessarily have the education, who don't necessarily understand how to get access to a safe and regular pathway. That's the place where I think we need to be working. So, I have traveled all over the world, and I can tell you in places like Turkey, in places like Japan, in places like Greece and Portugal and Italy, there's a strong need for migrants to come and work. They simply do not have the workforce they need. And that is true at all skill levels. But until we ensure that there are safe and regular pathways for people, especially in the lower skilled sectors, to access those pathways, there will still be driving forces for irregular migration.
And so where do you think can the IOM factor in terms of facilitating collaboration between other states and Pakistan to encourage those more legal or formal channels of migrating to other countries?
We're seeing increasingly that countries are entering into bilateral agreements in which they agree to assign or set aside visas in certain sectors in exchange for an agreement of the sending country to accept back migrants who've come irregularly. So that is one channel that's being explored. We'd like to see, in fact, a more regional approach. So the EU has recently put in place what they're calling this talent pool, right? And their concept is that across the European Union, there would be jobs available that could be offered to persons in lower skilled, in any skilled sector. So that is one particular area. But the way IOM fits in, I think, is we use the architecture that we've already built to resettle refugees, to resettle other vulnerable people, as a way to then connect people into a system that is more safe and regular. So we have in place the ability to screen people, to provide health assessments, to provide skills assessments, to help people travel, to once they travel, ensure that they're well integrated, to work with governments to make sure that they have the language skills, for example, they need. We have the whole range of pieces that we need to make this work. Our goal is to really encourage governments to use it in more creative and innovative ways to meet their market needs.
And now, speaking of Pakistan, the government is actually carrying out a policy, what it actually describes as or what it categorizes as Illegal Foreigners Repatriation Plan. And the reasons it has actually cited are, rise in crime such as violence, militancy, smuggling, drug trafficking, and money laundering that has been attributed to illegal migrants out here. What is IOM's position on this ongoing policy by the government here?
So we actually don't see evidence to suggest that migrants are the primary cause of any of the particular illegal activities, such as money laundering or petty theft or crime. And it's frankly, it's something we see around the world, is that oftentimes countries that are experiencing those phenomenon, it's easiest to point to migrants as the perpetrators of those crimes. So, Pakistan is going through the same thing we're seeing lots of different countries experience. But our view, ultimately, a country has a right to decide who can live within its borders. That is a sovereign right. Our hope really is that when they make decisions about who can stay and who has to leave, they do so, number one, with respect for human rights, right? Number two, particularly for people who are vulnerable, people who cannot live safely in the country from which they've come, that they continue to provide refuge for those people. And finally, when they do determine that someone does not have status to stay in the country, that they do so through a legal process, and that people have the opportunity to get their affairs in order and go home with dignity. I mean, ultimately, it's about people, right? We're talking about people, and our goal is to make sure that even while a country is enforcing its own laws, it does so with respect for human rights and human dignity.
So in terms of the long-term horizon, are you looking at particular partnerships that can take place between the IOM and Pakistan to make sure that the policies are designed in a more sensitized manner, that are not coming at the, in any way that are not adverse to people at the receiving end?
Yes, I mean, that's our goal with all countries, not just Pakistan. And as we're seeing play out in the headlines everywhere around the world, it is very easy to target migrants. It's not surprising because migrants don't vote, right? So migrants don't have the same political constituency. They don't have the same voice. And whether we are looking in Europe or we're in Turkey or we're in North America, in my own home country of the United States, we see it is very, very easy to point to migrants as the targets. Our hope is that our member states, our governments, will work with IOM to put in place policies that ultimately respect human rights and human dignity, right? To be sensitive to the particular vulnerabilities of communities that may not be able to go home safely. And then actually to take it a step further, to take a hard look at what are the economic needs within the country, and can we actually use migration as a way to address those needs, right? If you are a country in Europe at this moment in time where you do not have enough of your own national workers to do any number of jobs, migration makes sense. It actually is a much more effective way of addressing labor needs than trying to develop AI, for example, in order to do that.
That's a very interesting point that you mentioned. But do you think advances in technologies like the AI are going to somehow bring a declining trend towards migration itself, even in lower skilled jobs?
I think it's unlikely. There is a fantastic article written by an economist who I really admire called Lant Pritchett in Foreign Affairs, where he does an analysis about whether AI can overtake migration. And his reasoning is that there are certain job sectors where it is very, very difficult to develop AI. So where I think AI will actually impact jobs is more for the people who work for me writing talking points, frankly, right? So if you have to synthesize large amounts of information and present the key summary points, AI does that really well. But when it comes to taking care of your elderly parents, you can have a robot, right? But it will not provide the same level of attention and care as a human being. When it comes to whether it's agriculture or hospitality work, AI will just not provide the same results. And I think what we have seen consistently is that human touch actually makes a big difference. So while I think AI will allow people to do their jobs more efficiently, it will not take the place of people, particularly in a lot of these lower skilled sectors. Manufacturing in a solar plant, for example. If AI could do it, the companies would have done it. But instead, what we hear from companies is they need a sustainable workforce in order even to meet their green climate goals.
Now, Ms. Amy Pope, let me draw your attention to, the devastating floods that took place in 2022 in Pakistan. Millions of people were affected by it. A lot of them were also displaced as a consequence of it. What has IOM really done so far? And what does it really plan to do in terms of dealing with future crises like these in future as well?
So IOM has provided humanitarian support to the people who were affected by floods. It's the kind of work we do all over the world. So we have teams in Somalia, in South Sudan, in Mozambique, who are likewise providing just basic humanitarian support. Some of it is shelter, some of it's psychosocial support, some of it is hygiene kits, just to help people meet their fundamental needs. But where we want to go is to move away from just providing humanitarian support and moving toward anticipating and forecasting when communities will be displaced by climate change. And this is an area where actually I think AI can be quite useful, right? We can identify parts of the world where there are extreme vulnerabilities, whether to flood or to drought, rising sea levels, or desertification. And then our goal is to work with communities to help them adapt before they're hit by that devastating disaster. And in many, many cases, there are good options. Some of it is water management. Some of it is building appropriate infrastructure. Some of it is ensuring that people have the appropriate skills, recognizing if you are a farmer, your farming techniques that work today may not work in the climate of 10 years from now. So rather than waiting till the point where the farmer has no livelihood at all, we should be identifying how do we help that person adapt, whether it's new farming skills or new other job skills, so they can continue to make a living.
So would that mean then IOM has to work with not just organizations like the disaster management, but also other relevant ministries like the Ministry of Agriculture and others that can sort of help farmers or other, different actors of the society sort of unlearn and relearn some things that worked in the past but might not work in the future?
Absolutely. And that is a new way of thinking about migration, right? We don't wait until we've had millions of people displaced by floods. Instead, we look at a community that is in a floodplain. We identify what are their particular vulnerabilities and are there ways to shore up those vulnerabilities. And that means this won't just be IOM. Right? This is going to be a partnership with our government actors, non-government actors, other international organizations. But we have to, especially given the scale of the climate crisis this is coming our way, and in a country like Pakistan will have fairly devastating impacts on very vulnerable communities. If we want to save more lives, if we want to use our resources more efficiently, this is really the only way to do it.
And speaking of Pakistan, again, in context of the floods, Pakistan reached out to international community right after the floods, tried to mobilize support from them and secured pledges around 10 billion US dollars. Most of them certainly being loans. But let me ask you, do you think enough has been done in terms of, the mobilization of the resources to help the affected communities in terms of helping develop the safe shelters, or I must say, the supportive infrastructure to avert future crises?
Definitely not. I mean, this is, there's not enough that's been done. I mean, I think we just need to admit that.
So what could be done differently then?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, the first is, quite frankly, the world is seeing a range of crises. We have, in our organization, we designate emergencies based on how many internal resources we mobilize. So a level 3 means that everybody is mobilized, and we have headquarters, we have regional offices, we have missions, are all engaged to respond to the emergency. This year we had 8 level 3 emergencies, and that is unprecedented, right? So that means the scale of need has increased astronomically. And it means that our traditional donor communities are being stretched in ways that are unsustainable and are leaving people without the resources to not only adapt to the future, but respond to the present. But what we do know is that prevention is much more cost effective than disaster response, right? If you look even at our budget, the billions of dollars in our budget go to disaster response. The amount of money that goes into adaptation is much, much lower. We need to actually flip that, start to put more resources into adaptation so we can support more people.
But how difficult is it to have such kind of conversations to bring about a shift in attitude, to have more preventive approach by different states? How much of an uphill task is it for the IOM itself?
It's not easy, and what we see, and I've seen this in my work, whether it's with the government or with the private sector, you can preach prevention, but disaster sells, right? So we're always likely to get many more resources in the wake of especially images of human suffering, stories of people who've lost their livelihoods or have lost family members. But instead of waiting, instead of having to mobilize, I think that there are some really good initiatives that are now out there. We're seeing, for example, with the Loss and Damage Fund coming out of COP28, a recognition that funding support to manage human mobility was finally included. So that's a recognition that we actually need to use that fund in a more preventative way. We're seeing some good examples of how the Green Climate Fund is being mobilized. I was just in the Pacific Islands. You may know the Pacific Islands are facing some serious existential risk as a result of rising sea levels, which means that future populations won't have anywhere to live. And while it's difficult for the small states to get access to the fund, there are some examples. So we're really looking at who are our innovative financing partners. Is it these various trust funds, working with the World Bank, working with other financial institutions, and working with the private sector? Because ultimately, it's in the private sector's interest to see better migration outcomes and more stability.
And now, speaking of different conflicts that have been breaking out throughout the world, how does IOM actually seek to help people displaced by such conflicts? And do you think that there are enough measures in place by the IOM to help such affected people? Or do you think there needs to be done more in terms of helping such people?
So currently, we are very, very good at providing humanitarian support, right? If there is an emergency, we are quick to mobilize, we get resources and our people in place to provide that support. Within hours of the earthquakes in Afghanistan, for example, we had mobilized teams and were out there providing support. Within hours of the earthquakes in Turkey, we were mobilizing teams and providing support. So on that kind of quick action, let's mobilize, we're excellent at it. Now, where I think we and other agencies need to improve is on this other piece we're talking about. That's the sea change. Rather than waiting, let's start to map out areas of high risk and make sure that we have the supplies we need pre-positioned so we can get them out faster. Let's build our partnership with the private sector entities who now already have in place sophisticated systems to keep their supply chains intact even in the wake of disaster. So we recently signed an agreement with Amazon in order to do just that. And then finally, this last point of let's start to anticipate before the disaster happens. So this is a new way of approaching the issues of displacement. I'd say at the same time, we are learning, along with our colleagues in the UN family, that it's not enough just to provide somebody with a shelter, right, and a hygiene kit. We need to think actively and then build solutions for a community that's going to be displaced for some long period of time. So we see communities that have been displaced for years. At that point, you need to transition to how do we enable these communities to make a living.
And does it also mean that bringing along or sort of bringing the same paradigm to people that have been affected by conflicts as well?
Absolutely. Now, conflict is the primary difference between conflict and climate is our ability to anticipate and mitigate. Because in climate, we can work with a farming community to use new agricultural techniques, right? Or we can teach somebody new skills and help them get access to a different labor market. Conflict, the solutions tend to be political. And we take a backseat on the political role and we defer to others. So there's a slightly different dynamic there when it comes to how much we can anticipate. My goal is, as much as possible, when there's the ability to anticipate and forecast and plan, that we make sure we're doing that. Then when there is conflict and there are people being displaced very, very quickly, we can mobilize the humanitarian resources to meet those needs. Right now, we're in a posture where everything is being treated as an emergency, and the results are stretching resources, stretching people, stretching capacity.
And lastly, before we wrap up this conversation, my last question is, what are some of the areas where you think Pakistan and IOM can actually foster their partnership?
So I'm most excited about building out capacity around regular pathways, because there's a tremendous population here within the country whose skills are needed around the world. And I'm deeply concerned about people getting on boats without any protections and losing their lives in order to get access to those opportunities. So I'm hopeful, and this is not easy, so let me be clear, but I'm hopeful that this is the area where we can really start to put in place measures to provide real and meaningful and sustainable opportunities for more people.
And will that also mean having partnership with organizations beyond law enforcement agencies as well?
Absolutely. Law enforcement isn't that good at providing job opportunities, let's be clear, right? So that means we are working with the private sector. We are working with the OECD. We're looking at labor market analyses. We're looking at the issue not from a security lens as much as from an economic and development lens. And that is really the exciting piece here. It's not that the security issues disappear, and it's not that the border management issues disappear. They all are part of the equation. But ultimately, we want to separate out who are the people who are just looking for job opportunities, right? Who are the people who are just vulnerable where they live now? And can we provide better solutions for that community of people?
Ms. Amy Pope, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, and thank you for taking out the time today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with Ms. Amy Pope. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.
Watch this exciting conversation about how we make migration work for all people on Infer.